Monday, January the 20th, 2020, I posted Anachronism 2962. It's called A Dying Language. I nicked myself shaving this morning as the person I saw in the mirror, who was not me, but my imagination, perhaps a vision from the other end of the planet, the opposite end, or perhaps complete imagination, evaporated, leaving my face markedly odd in the mirror. Fractals of it, cracked in dozens of pieces, or so it seemed, by the dancing rivulets of crimson rushing down my cheeks and ears and over my lips and chin, down onto my white-haired chest. These scarlet lines made me forget the tragedy of the evaporation of my mirrored companion. I have an active imagination, as my friends, my doctors tell me. I still recognize the beauty of the tiny puff of moisture that disappeared into something like a tiny war of droplets of acid played out, until my glistening red facial springtime thaw, forcing me into dozens of pieces, became even more beautiful than the fancy evaporation and disappearance of my face's companion face. The luck of the razor in the anguished hand. That hand that had yet to cup the, if I were to imagine it to be real somewhere, somehow, face that appeared so perfectly in the mirror this morning, which has already landed for real in London or Singapore or Korea by now, far from the crusade of the Phantom Battalion forced by the mixture of the sour vapor and crimson cracks that tore poor Humpty so severely that all the king's horses and all the king's men could never put it back together again. All the pieces of the puzzle mystically sticking incongruently, their open mouths out of which gaped each odd-shaped tongue attempting to lock them together forever. Everything about this odd head, so very real until it was covered in the mist of the piping hot water, rose like a big translucent balloon with a head in it, and dissipated without even a pop over the reaches of the mirror into a warm melt of nothingness, which floated by the school of poetry in the south of this land at the other end of the continent, through all of the gibberish of English residue, to a place where no war had ever been seen. What a fantastical world, this place where the language was so foreign, and the English residue of the gibberish kept whispering, as if taunting those who live there every day, except when they travel to show up in long-away mirrors. Only the taunts no longer affected these beautiful inhabitants. It was only a susurration that swept the countryside, affecting no one but perhaps the occasional tourist. The fantastical land had given over to an amorality with crippling sharks that circled angrily in every pond that was nearly deep enough, with sultans to the south having never traveled far enough north to even see this aged empire, and just above the border to the north of the Empire of Heads that showed up in mirrors halfway across the planet, there were caravans and caverns filled with gold. None of the inhabitants of the land of susurration had seen any of this gold, but wandered their fields of rice, daydreaming of the green of currency that grows the greenest. The longer the afternoon, the greener their alcoholic dreams of recurrence, until, without one of the inhabitants of the empire lifting its head, the country grew full of people who lived in the north with hundreds of caves full of gold, and even further north than that. They appeared from nowhere with handwritten bills suggesting the gold existed and could be traded for anything, including every parcel of the land of the empire between the sultans and the golden caverns. Soon the land belonged to the northerners for no reason, and there were piles of papers drawn suggestive of the gold, which at first pleased the inhabitants and quenched the thirst that had developed by the breeze of the constant susurration of the gibberish of the English residue. The northerners had devised a plan to trade every parcel of land for a piece of their paper, suggestive of the gold in the caves near where they had formerly lived, the land now hollow and hard to walk upon. It was around then that the king of the empire of susurration began to breathe his last breaths. This was a kind who had seen no war, who had lived longer than any other king, and whose name was no longer than anyone could know except those who lived in the land of susurration. Each inhabitant began to call the king by his name, and before anyone could finish that name, his royal namesake was gone. The inhabitants soon discovered that their land had been taken from them in bits and pieces until they had none left to themselves, by the northerners and their pieces of paper which suggested gold, all without their express consent or knowledge. And why not? They were busy, they were happy, they were automatons. The men gambled away their weekends in ways Las Vegas would ridicule. Their wives, still almost believed property, took on the aura of the current and future Stepford wives of other empires, who soon found their demise among gadgets and electronic circuits while their husbands spent long weekends gambling. What else was there to do, they thought? The dreams of the fathers and the dreams of the mothers became the green dream of beaten skepticism, and so on and so on and so on, ad infinitum, while the children played in the fields of rice or in the ponds full of sharks, never knowing any better. The kingdom was demoted to a land of open arms, attached to wide, smiling and welcoming faces, to arms up, raised in fear, which made their mouths tremble uncontrollably, through which they would speak, in succor or in solace, the dead language that rose above the tourists' ears, who would come season after season to the same destination, and whose papers, filled with the suggestion of gold, mixed with the currency of the land, unbeknownst to the tourists, whose lips smacked of alcoholic coffee beverages and ganja leaves. They would each arrive at the same destinations as last season and the season before that, never knowing the difference.